I've not been live this entire time. I forgot to hit go live. I just had the silliest moment of my life. I've not been live this entire time. I forgot to hit go live. Hi, y'all. I just had the silliest moment of my life. I've not been live this entire time. Oh, please don't tell me my audio's been repeating. I just had the silliest moment of my life. Oh, please don't tell me my audio's been repeating. Hi, y'all. It's been a full hour, or at least half an hour, of me talking to dead air because I forgot to hit go live. Silly me. The scuff, it's real. Okay. So, now that I've read a full 2 chapters of a book to completely no one, that title has a maybe in it. That maybe is because I was considering whether or not I should continue reading tonight or do something else because it felt like I had lost my mojo a little. Not in any bad way, and I might chill for a bit and just hang with y'all and maybe play something or find something a little different or interesting to read for the night. Issue is I still haven't decided what. Also, hi, y'all. New people, if you're watching, old people, you already know me. Willow here. Yeah, bright side. I got a little practice in for the 2 chapters I read. And OBS didn't start streaming when I hit go live. It's supposed to automatically do that. Oh well. Bit of a learning curve, but we'll get through it with ease. So, Chapter 12. Patrick O'Shaughnessy stood on the corner of 72nd and Central Park West, staring at the facade of the Dakota apartment building. There was a vast arched entrance to an inner courtyard, and beyond the entrance, the building ran at least a third of the way down the block. It was there, in the darkness, that Pendergast had been attacked. In fact, probably looked just about like this when Pendergast was stabbed. Except for the old man, of course. The one Pendergast had seen wearing a derby hat. Astonishing that the guy had almost managed to overpower the FBI agent, even factoring in the element of surprise. O'Shaughnessy wondered again just what the hell he was doing here. He was off duty. He should be in JW's, hoisting a few with friends, or messing about his apartment, listening to that new recording of The Bartered Bride. They weren't paying him, so why should he care? But he found, strangely enough, that he did care. Custer, naturally, had dismissed it as a simple mugging. Friggin' rube out of towner. No surprise he got his ass mugged. Well, O'Shaughnessy knew Pendergast was no rube. The man probably played up his New Orleans roots just to keep people like Custer off guard. Stumbling again. And he didn't think Pendergast had gotten mugged either. But now it was time to decide. Just what was he going to do about it? Slowly, he began to walk toward the site of the attack. Earlier in the day, he'd visited Pendergast in the hospital. Pendergast had hinted to him that it would be useful, more than useful, to have the coroner's report on the bones found at the construction site. To get it, O'Shaughnessy realized, he would have to go around Custer. Pendergast also wanted more information on the developer, Fairhaven, who Custer had made it clear was off limits. It was then, O'Shaughnessy realized, he had crossed some invisible line. From working for Custer to working for Pendergast. It was a new, almost heady feeling. For the first time in his life, he was working with someone he respected. Someone who wasn't going to prejudge him on his old history, or treat him as a disposable, fifth-generation Irish cop. That was the reason he was here, at the Dakota, on his night off. Let me read that. That was the reason he was here at the Dakota, on his night off. That's what a partner did when the other one got into trouble. Pendergast, as usual, was silent on the attack. But to O'Shaughnessy, it had none of the earmarks of a mugging. He remembered, dimly, his days at the academy, all the statistics on various types of crimes, and how they were committed. Back then, he had big ideas about where he was going in the force. That was before he took $200 from a prostitute because he felt sorry for her. And, he had to admit to himself, because he needed the money. O'Shaughnessy stopped, coughed, spat on the sidewalk. Back at the academy, it had been motive, means, opportunity. Take motive, for starters. Why kill Pendergast? Put the facts in order. 1. The guy's investigating a 130-year-old serial killer. No motive there. Killer's dead. 2. A copycat killer springs up. Pendergast is at the autopsy before there's even an autopsy. Christ, he thought. Christ, thought O'Shaughnessy. He must have known what was going on even before the doctor did. Pendergast had already made the connection between the murder of the tourist, and the 19th century killings. How? 3. Pendergast gets attacked. Those were the facts as O'Shaughnessy saw them. So what could he conclude? That Pendergast already knew something important. And the copycat serial killer knew it too. Whatever it was important enough that this killer took a big risk in targeting him on 72nd Street. Not exactly deserted, even at 9 o'clock in the evening. And had almost succeeded in killing him, which was the most astonishing thing of all. O'Shaughnessy swore. The big mystery here was Pendergast himself. He wished Pendergast would level with him, share him more information. The man was keeping him in the dark. Why? Now that was a question worth asking. He swore again. Pendergast was asking a hell of a lot, but he wasn't giving anything in return. Why was he wasting a fine fall evening tramping around the Dakota, looking for clues that weren't there, for a guy who didn't want help? Cool it, O'Shaughnessy told himself. Pendergast was the most logical, methodical guy he'd ever met. He'd have his reasons, all in good time. Meanwhile, this was a waste. Time for dinner and the latest issue of Opera News. O'Shaughnessy turned to head home, and that's when he saw the tall, shadowy figure come into view at the corner. Instinctively, O'Shaughnessy shrank into the nearest doorway. He waited. The figure stood on the corner, precisely where he himself had stood only a few minutes before. Glancing around. Then, it started down the street toward him, slowly and furtively. O'Shaughnessy stiffened, receding deeper into the shadows. The figure crept down to the angle of the building, pausing right at the spot where Pendergast had been assaulted. The beam of a flashlight went on. He seemed to be inspecting the pavement, looking around. He was dressed in a long, dark coat, which could easily be concealing a weapon. He was certainly no cop, and the attack had not been in the papers. O'Shaughnessy made a quick decision. He grasped his service revolver in his right hand and pulled out his shield with his left. Then he stepped out of the shadows. "Police officer," he said quietly, but firmly. "Don't move. Keep your hands where I can see them." The figure jumped sideways with a yelp, holding up a pair of gangly arms. "Wait! Don't shoot! I'm a reporter!" O'Shaughnessy relaxed as he recognized the man. "So it's you," he said, holstering his gun, feeling disappointed. "Yeah? And it's you." Smithback lowered his trembling arms. "The cop from the opening. Sergeant O'Shaughnessy." "Right. What are you doing here?" "Same as you, probably," said O'Shaughnessy. Then he stopped abruptly, remembering he was speaking to a reporter. It wouldn't be good for this to get back to Custer. Smithback mopped his brow with a soiled handkerchief. "You scared the piss out of me." "Sorry. You looked suspicious." Smithback shook his head. "I imagine I did." He glanced around. "Find anything?" "No." There was a brief silence. "Who do you think did it? Think it was just a mugger?" Although Smithback was echoing the same question he'd asked himself moments before, O'Shaughnessy merely shrugged. The best thing to do was to keep his mouth shut. "Surely the police have some kind of theory." O'Shaughnessy shrugged again. Smithback stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, I understand if it's confidential. I can quote you not for attribution." O'Shaughnessy wasn't going to fall into that trap. Smithback sighed, looking up at the buildings with an air of finality. "Well, there's nothing much else to be seen around here. And if you're going to clam up, I might as well go get a drink. Try to recover from that fright you gave me." He snugged the handkerchief back into his pocket. "Night, officer." He began to walk away. Then he stopped, as if struck by an idea. Oh, I'm out of it. "Want to come along?" "No, thanks." "Come on," the reporter said. "You don't look like you're on duty." "I said no." I need to work on my accents. Smithback took a step closer. "You know, now that I think about it, maybe we could help each other out here. Know what I mean? I need to keep in touch with this investigation into the surgeon." "The surgeon?" "Haven't you heard? That's what the Post is calling this serial killer. Cheesy, huh? Anyway, I need information, and I'll bet you need information. Am I right?" O'Shaughnessy said nothing. He did need information, but he wondered if Smithback really had something, or was just bullshitting. "I'll level with you, Sergeant. I got scooped on that tourist killing in Central Park. And now, I have to scramble to get new developments, or my editor will have my ass for brunch. A little advice notice here and there. Nothing too specific. Just a nod from a friend. You, for instance. That's all. What kind of information do you have? O'Shaughnessy asked guardedly. He thought back a minute to what Pendergast had said. Do you have anything on, say, Fairhaven? Smithback rolled his eyes. Are you kidding me? I've got a sack full on him. Not that it'll do much good, but I'm willing to share. Let's talk about it over a drink. O'Shaughnessy glanced up and down the street. Despite his better judgment, he found himself tempted. Smithback might be a hustler, but he seemed a decent sort of hustler. And he'd even worked with Pendergast in the past, though the reporter didn't seem too eager to reminisce about it. And finally, Pendergast had asked him to put together a file on Fairhaven. Where? Smithback smiled. You kidding me? The best bars in New York are just 1 block west on Columbus. I know a great place where all the museum types go. It's called the Bones. Come on. First round's on me. I really hope those first few sips weren't audible. That would be mortifying. They were. Oh, that's horrifying. My apologies for the impromptu ASMR, y'all. That was not meant to happen. I should really point the microphone away like this. Therefore, you can't hear anything. My apologies for the impromptu ASMR, y'all. That was not meant to happen. I should really point the microphone away like this. Therefore, you can't hear anything. I'm gonna be honest, y'all. I'm just not feeling it tonight. My apologies for the insanely scuffed and weird stream. I might pull this one down and restart from that chapter again next Monday. In the meantime, because I don't want to leave y'all hanging for, balls, I just hit my desk again, for 20 minutes after an hour of nothing, I should think of something to do. What that something will be, I have yet to decide. Hello to whoever just joined. Oh, it's on top chat still. It's not on live chat. I hate when it does that. I may not be feeling it, but hey, might as well get another chapter in while I'm here. Again, I will apologize for the accidental ASMR and slurping of my water. I will remember to kick my chair away from my desk so that you don't hear that again. Chapter 13. The fog grew thicker for a moment. Pendergast waited, maintaining his concentration. Then, through the fog, came flickerings of orange and yellow. Pendergast felt heat upon his face. The fog began to clear. He was standing outside J.C. Shodham's cabinet of natural productions and curiosities. It was night. The cabinet was burning. Angry flames leapt from the first and second-story windows, punching through billowing clouds of black, acrid smoke. Pardon? Several firemen and a bevy of police were frantically roping off the street around the building and pushing curious onlookers back from the conflagration inside the rope. No, there's a period there. Conflagration. Inside the rope, several knots of firefighters arced hopeless streams of water into the blaze, while others scurried to douse the gaslights along the sidewalk. The heat was a physical force. A wall. Standing on the street corner, Pendergast's gaze lingered appreciatively on the fire engine. A big black boiler on carriage wheels, belching steam. A Muskeg manufacturing company in gold letters on its sweating sides. Then he turned toward the onlookers. Would Lang be among them, admiring his handiwork? No. He would have been long gone. Lang was no pyromaniac. He would be safely ensconced in his uptown house, location unknown. The location of the house is the great question, but another, perhaps more pressing question remained. Where had Lang moved his laboratory? There was a tremendous, searing crack. Roof timbers collapsed inward with a roiling shower of sparks. An appreciative murmur rose from the crowd. With a final look at the doomed structure, Pendergast began threading his way through the crowd. A little girl rushed up, no older than 6, threadbare and frighteningly gaunt. She had a battered straw broom in her hand, and she swept the street corner ahead of him industriously, clearing away the dung and pestilent garbage. Pestilential. Word you don't see every day. Hoping pathetically for a coin. Thank you, Pendergast said, tossing her several broad copper pennies. She looked at the coins, eyes wide at her good fortune, then curtsied awkwardly. What's your name, child? Pendergast asked gently. The girl looked up at him, as if surprised to hear an adult speak to her in such a solicitous tone. Constance Green, sir, she said. Green? Pendergast frowned. Of Water Street? No, sir. Not anymore. Something seemed to have frightened the girl, and, with another curtsy, she turned and melted away down a crowded side street. Pendergast stared down the foul street and its seething crowds for some time. Then, with a troubled expression on his face, he turned and slowly retraced his steps. A barker stood in the doorway of Brown's restaurant, delivering the bill of fare in a loud, breathless, ceaseless litany. I read this once, and that was before I was streaming, before I realized the silly bit. I don't think I'm going to do this bit again, but so that you know, it's 3 lines, no spaces, all of them italicized. I could post a picture of it at some point just so that you can see the silliness. Pendergast moved on thoughtfully, listening to the City Hall bell toll the urgent fire alarm. Making his way to Park Street, he passed a chemist shop, closed and shuttered, an array of bottles in diverse sizes and colors decorating the window. Payne's Celery Compound, Swamp Root, D and A, Janss's Native American Cure Oil, good for man and beast. 2 blocks down Park, he stopped abruptly. He was fully attentive now, eyes open to every detail. He had painstakingly researched this region of old New York, and the fog of his memory construct retreated well into the distance. Here, Baxter and Worth Streets angled in sharply, creating a crazy quilt of intersections known as the 5 Points. In the bleak landscape of urban decay that stretched before him, there was none of the carefree revelry Pendergast had found earlier along Bowery. 30 years before, in the 1850s, the Points had been the worst slum in all of New York. In all America. Worse even than London's 7 Dials. It remained a miserable, squalid, dangerous place, home to 50,000 criminals, drug addicts, prostitutes, orphans, confidence men, villains of all shape and description. I love when they do lists, and the end is so abrupt. Orphans, confidence men, villains of all shape and description. There we go. The uneven streets are broken and scoured into dangerous ruts. Scored, not scoured. Scored. Brimming with garbage and offal. Hogs wandered about, rooting and wallowing in the fouled gutters. The houses seemed prematurely aged, their windows broken, tar paper roofs hanging free, timbers sagging. A single gas lamp threw light into the intersection. On all sides, narrow streets marched off into endless darkness. The doors of the first-floor taverns were flung wide against the summer heat. The smells of liquor and cigar smoke issued forth. Pardon? Hold on. Women, bare-breasted, lolled in the doorways, exchanging obscene jeers with whores in the neighboring saloons, or soliciting passer-by in lurid tones. Across the way, nickel-a-night flophouses, riddled with vermin and pestilence, sat between the shabby cowsheds of fencers of stolen goods. Pendergast gazed carefully around at the scene, scrutinizing the topography, the architecture, for any clue, any hidden link that a mere study of historical records could not provide. At last, he turned eastward, where a vast 5-story structure sat, decayed and listing, dark even in the light of the gas lamp. This was the former old brewery, at one time the worst of all the 5 Points tenements. Children who had the misfortune to be born within were known to pass months or even years without tasting the outside air. Now, thanks to the efforts of a charitable group, it had been rebuilt as the 5 Points Mission, an early urban renewal project for which, in 1880, the good Dr. Enoch Lang had volunteered his medical services, pro bono. He continued to work there into the early 90s, when the historical record of Lang vanished abruptly. Pendergast walked slowly toward the building. An ancient sign for the old brewery remained painted along its upper story, dominating the far newer and cleaner 5 Points mission sign beneath. He considered entering the building, then decided against it. There was another visit he had to make first. Behind the 5 Points mission, a tiny alley ran north into a dark cul-de-sac. Moist, fetid air seeped out from the darkness. Many years before, when the Points region had been a marshy pond known as the Collect, Aaron Burr had installed a large subterranean pump for the natural springs at this spot, founding the New Amsterdam Water Company. The pond grew increasingly foul, however, and eventually he had been filled in to make way for tenements. Pendergast paused thoughtfully. Later, this alleyway had been known as Cow Bay, the most dangerous street in the 5 Points. It had been crowded with tall wooden tenements with names like Brickbat Mansion and the Gates of Hell. Tenanted by violent alcoholics who would stab a man for the clothes on his back. Like many structures in the 5 Points, these were warrens of vile-smelling chambers, honeycombed with secret panels and doors that connected to other houses on adjoining streets by networks of underground passageways, allowing criminals easy escape from pursuing law enforcement. In the mid-19th century, the streets had averaged a murder a night. Now, it was home to an ice delivery company, a slaughterhouse, and an abandoned substation of the city's waterworks, shut down in 1879 when the uptown reservoir rendered it obsolete. Pendergast moved on another block, then turned left onto Little Water Street. At the far corner was the 5 Points House of Industry, the other orphanage, graced with the medical attention of Enoch Lang. It was a tall Beaux Arts building, punctuated along its north end by a tower. A small rectangular widow's walk, buttressed by iron fencing, sat atop its mansard roof. The building looked woefully out of place among the shabby wooden houses and ramshackle squatteries. He stared up at the heavy-browed windows. Why had Lang chosen to lend his services to these two missions, one after the other, in 1880, the year before Shodham's cabinet burned? Even if he was looking for an endless source of impoverished victims, whose absence would cause no alarm, the cabinet was a better choice than a workhouse. 2 seconds. After all, one could have only so many mysterious disappearances before someone grew suspicious. And why had Lang chosen these missions in particular? There were countless others in Lower Manhattan. Why had Lang decided to work, and presumably draw his pool of victims from this spot? Pendergast stepped back onto the cobbles, glancing up and down the lane, thinking. Of all the streets he had traveled, Little Water Street was the only one no longer extant in the 20th century. It had been paved over, built upon, forgotten. He had seen old maps that showed it, naturally, but no map had ever drawn had superimposed its course onto present-day Manhattan. An incredibly shabby man with a horse and cart came down the street, ringing a bell, collecting garbage for tips, a brace of tamed hogs following behind him. Pendergast did not heed him. Instead, he glided back down the narrow road, pausing at the entrance to Cow Bay. Although, with the disappearance of Little Water Street, it was difficult to tell on modern maps, Pendergast now saw that the two missions would both have backed onto these terrible old tenements. Those dwellings were gone, but the warren of tunnels that once served their criminal residents would have remained. He glanced down both sides of the alley. Slaughterhouse, ice factory, abandoned waterworks. It suddenly made perfect sense. More slowly now, Pendergast walked away, headed for Baxter Street and points north. He could, of course, have ended his journey at this point, have opened his eyes to the present-day books and tubes and monitor screens. But he preferred to continue the discipline of this mental exercise, to take the long way back to Lenox Hill Hospital. He was curious to see if the fire at Shodham's cabinet had been brought under control. Perhaps he would hire a carriage uptown, or, better yet, walk up past the Madison Square Garden Circus, past Delmonico's, past the palaces of Fifth Avenue. There was much to think about, much more than he had previously imagined, and 1881 was as good a place as any to do it in. 2 seconds. Okay. I take a sec this time, not audible, hopefully. Chapter 14. Norris stopped at the nurse's station to ask directions to Pendergast's new room. A sea of hostile faces greeted the question. Clearly, Nora thought, Pendergast was as popular at Lenox as he had been at St. Luke's Roosevelt. She found him lying up in his bed, the blinds shut tight against the sun. He looked very tired, his face gray. His blonde white hair hung limply over his high forehead, and his eyes were closed. As she entered, they slowly opened. "I'm sorry," Nora said. "This is a bad time." "Not at all. I did ask you to see me. Please clear off that chair. Sit down." Nora moved the stack of books and papers from the chair to the floor, wondering again what this was about. She'd already given him a report about her visit with the old lady, and told him it would be her last assignment for him. He had to understand that it was time for her to get back to her own career. As intriguing as it was, she was not about to commit professional harakiri over this business. Pendergast's eyes had drooped until they were almost closed, but she could still see the pale irises behind the slitted lids. "How are you?" Courtesy required she ask that question, but there wouldn't be any others. She'd listen to what he had to say, then leave. Lang acquired his victims from the cabinet himself. Yeah, I am out of my groove. I need to practice more. Lang acquired his victims from the cabinet itself, Pendergast said. "How do you know?" "He captured them at the back of one of the halls, most likely a small cul-de-sac housing a particularly gruesome exhibit. He would lie in wait until a visitor was alone, then he'd snatch his victim, take the unfortunate through a door at the rear of the exhibit, which led down the back stairs to the coal cellar. It was a perfect setup. Street people vanished all the time in that neighborhood. Undoubtedly, Lang selected victims that would not be missed. Street urchins, workhouse boys and girls." He spoke in a monotone, as if reviewing his findings within his own mind instead of explaining them to her. "From 1872 to 1881, he used the cabinet for this purpose. 9 years. 36 victims that we know of. Perhaps many more Lang disposed of in some other way. As you know, there had in fact been many rumors of people vanishing in the cabinet. These no doubt served to increase its popularity." Nora shuddered. "Then, in 1888, he killed Chodam and burned the cabinet. We, of course, know why. Chodam found out that what he was up to. He said as much in his letter to McFadden. But that letter has, in its own way, been misleading me all this time. Lang would have killed Chodam anyway." Pendergast paused to take a few breaths. The confrontation with Chodam merely gave him the excuse he needed to burn the cabinet. You see, Phase 1 of his work was complete. "Phase 1? He had achieved what he had set out to do. He perfected his formula." "You don't seriously mean Lang was able to prolong his own life?" "He clearly believed he could. In his mind, the experimentation phase could cease. Production could begin. Victims would still be required, but many fewer than before. The cabinet, with its high volume of foot traffic, was no longer necessary. In fact, it had become a liability. It was imperative for Lang to cover his tracks and start fresh." There was a silence. Then Pendergast resumed. "A year before the cabinet burned, Lang offered his services to two workhouses in the vicinity. The 5 Points House of Industry and the 5 Points Mission. The two were connected by the warren of old underground tunnels that riddled the entire 5 Points area in the 19th century. In Lang's day, a foul alley known as Cow Bay lay between the workhouses. Along with the sordid tenements you'd expect, Cow Bay was home to an ancient subterranean pumping station dating back to the days of the collect pond. The waterworks were shut down and sealed for good about a month before Lang had allied himself with the workhouses. That is no mere coincidence of dates. What are you saying? The abandoned waterworks was the site of Lang's production laboratory. The place he went after burning Shodham's cabinet. It was secure, and better still, it provided easy underground access to both workhouses. An ideal place to begin production of the substance he believed to prolong his life. I have the old plans for the waterworks here. Pendergast waved his hand weakly. Nora glanced over the complex set of diagrams. She wondered what had so exhausted the agent. He had seemed much better the day before. She hoped he hadn't taken a turn for the worst. Today, of course, the workhouses, the tenements, even many of the streets are gone. A 3-story brownstone was built directly above the site of Lang's production laboratory. Number 99 Doyer Street, erected in the 1920s off Chatham Square. Broken into 1-bedroom flats, with a separate 2-bedroom apartment in the basement. Any trace of Lang's laboratory would lie under the building. Nora thought for a moment. Excavating Lang's production laboratory would no doubt be a fascinating archaeological project. There would be evidence there, and as an archaeologist, she could find it. She wondered, once again, why Pendergast was so interested in these 19th century murders. It would be of some historical solace to know that Mary Green's killer had been brought to light. She abruptly terminated the line of thought. She had her own work to do, her own career to salvage. She had to remind herself, once again, that this was history. Pendergast sighed, turned slightly in the bed. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. Now, you'd better go. I'm badly in need of sleep. Nora glanced at him in surprise. She had been expecting another plea for her help. Why did you ask to see me exactly? You've been a great help to me in this investigation. More than once, you've asked for more information than I could give you. I assumed you wished to know what I've discovered. You've earned that, at the very least. There's a detestable term one hears bandied about these days. Closure. Detestable, but in this case, appropriate. I hope this knowledge will bring you some degree of closure, and allow you to continue your work at the museum without a sense of unfinished business. I offer my sincerest thanks for your help. It has been invaluable. Nora felt a twinge of offense at this abrupt dismissal. She reminded herself that this was what she had wanted. Wasn't it? After a moment, she spoke. Thanks for saying so, but, if you ask me, this business sounds totally unfinished. If you're right about this, 99 Doyer Street seems like the next logical step. That is correct. The basement apartment is currently unoccupied, and an excavation below the living room floor would be most instructive. I plan to rent the apartment myself and undertake that excavation, and that is why I must recover as quickly as possible. Take care, Dr. Kelly. He shifted with an air of finality. Who's going to do the excavation? She asked. I will find another archaeologist. No, wait, let's say I will find another archaeologist. Nora looked at him sharply. Where? Through the New Orleans field office. They are most flexible when it comes to my projects. Right, said Nora briskly. But this isn't just a job for any archaeologist. This requires someone with special skills in... Are you offering? Nora was silent. Of course you're not. That's why I didn't ask. You've more than once expressed your desire to return to a more normal course of work. I've imposed upon you too much as it is. Besides, this investigation has taken a dangerous turn, Far more so than I initially assumed. An assumption I have paid for, as you can see. I would not wish you exposed to any more danger than you've been already. Nora stood up. Well, she said, I guess that's settled. I've enjoyed working with you, Mr. Pendergast. If enjoy is the right word. It's certainly been interesting. She felt vaguely dissatisfied with this outcome, even though it was what she had come down here to achieve. Indeed, said Pendergast. Most interesting. She began to walk toward the door, and stopped, remembering something. But I may be in touch with you again. I got a note from Reinhard Puck in the archives. Says he's found some new information. Ask him to stop by later this afternoon. If it seems useful, I'll pass it on. Pendergast's pale eyes were still regarding her attentively. Do that. And again, Dr. Kelly, you have my thanks. Be very careful. She nodded, then turned to leave, smiling at the baleful stares that greeted her as she passed the nurse's station. Few seconds. Time 9:58. Chapter 15. The door to the archives gave out a sharp creak as Nora eased it open. There had been no response to her knocking, and the door was unlocked, in clear violation of regulations. Very strange. The smell of old books, papers, and the odor of corruption that seemed to suffuse the entire museum hung in her nostrils. Puck's desk lay in the center of a pool of light, a wall of darkness beyond. Puck himself was nowhere to be seen. Nora checked her watch. 4 p.m. She was right on time. She released the door and its side back into place. She turned the lock and approached the desk, heels clicking on the marble floor. She signed in automatically, scrawling her name at the top of a fresh page in the logbook. Puck's desk was neater than usual, and a single typewritten note sat in the middle of the green felt pad. She glanced at it. I'm on the Triceratops in the back. The Triceratops, Nora thought, looking into the gloom. Leave it to Puck to be off dusting old relics. But where the hell was the Triceratops? She didn't recall having seen one, and there were no lights on in the back that she could see. The damn Triceratops could be anywhere. She looked around. No diagram of the archives either. Typical. Feeling an undercurrent of irritation, she moved to the banks of ivory light switches. She snapped a few on at random. Lights sprang up here and there, deep within the archives, casting long shadows down the rows of metal shelving. Might as well turn them all on, she thought, flipping whole rows of switches with the edge of her hand. But even with all the lights, the archives remained curiously shadowy and dim, large pools of darkness and long dim aisles predominating. She waited, half expecting Puck to call out to her. There was no sound except the distant ticking of steam pipes and the hiss of the forced air ducts. Mr. Puck? She called tentatively. Her voice reverberated and died. No answer. She called again, louder this time. The archives were so vast, she wondered if her voice could penetrate to the rear. For a minute, she considered coming back another time, but Puck's message had been most insistent. Vaguely, She recalled seeing some mounted fossil skeletons on her last visit. Maybe she would find the Triceratops among them. With a sigh, she began walking down one of the aisles, listening to the clatter of her shoes against the marble. Although the entrance to the aisle had been brightly lit, it soon grew shadowy and dim. It was amazing how poorly illuminated the place was. In the middle sections of the aisles, far from the light, how poorly illuminated the place was. In the middle sections of the aisles, far from the lights, one almost needed a flashlight to make out the objects stacked on the shelves. At the next pool of light, Nora found herself at a junction, from which several aisles wandered away at a variety of angles. She paused, considered which to take. It's like Hansel and Gretel in here, she thought, and I'm fresh out of breadcrumbs. The aisle closest to their left went in a direction that, she remembered, led to a grouping of stuffed animals, but its few lights were burned out, and it vanished into darkness. Nora shrugged and took the next aisle over. It felt so different, walking these passages alone. The last time, she'd been with Pendergast and Puck. She had been thinking about Shotem and hadn't paid much attention to her surroundings. With Puck guiding their steps, she hadn't even bothered to notice the strange jog these aisles took, the odd angles at which they met. It was the most eccentric layout imaginable, made even more eccentric by its vast size. Her thoughts were interrupted as the aisle took a sharp turn to the left. Around the corner, she unexpectedly came upon a number of freestanding African mammals: giraffes, a hippo, a pair of lions, wildebeests, kudu, water buffalo. Each was wrapped in plastic, bestowing a muffled, ghostly appearance. Nora stopped. No sign of a triceratops. Dang it. And once again, the aisle slid away in a half-frozen direction. Half-frozen? In half a dozen directions. And my mind's wandering. She chose one at random, following it through one jog, then another, coming abruptly to another intersection. This was getting ridiculous. "Mr. Puck!" she called out loudly. The echoes of her voice gradually faded away. The hiss of forced air filled the ensuing silence. She didn't have time for this. She would come back later, and she called first to make sure Puck was waiting at his desk. Better still, she'd just tell him to take whatever it was he wanted to show her directly to Pendergast. She was off the case, anyway. She turned to walk out of the archives, taking what she thought would be the shortest path. After a few minutes, she came to a stop beside a rhino and several zebras. They looked like lumpy sentinels beneath the omnipresent plastic, giving off a strong smell of paradichlorobenzene. Paradichlorobenzene. There we go. These aisles didn't look familiar, and she didn't seem to be any closer to the exit. For a moment, she felt a small current of anxiety. Then she shook it away with a forced laugh. She'd just make her way back to the giraffes, then retrace her steps from there. As she turned, her foot landed in a small puddle of water. She looked up just as a drop of water splattered on her forehead, condensation from the pipes far overhead. She shook it away and moved on. But she couldn't seem to find her way back to the giraffes. This was crazy. She'd navigated through trackless deserts, dense rainforests. How could she be lost in a museum in the middle of New York City? She looked around, realizing it was her sense of direction she had lost. With all these angled aisles, these dimly lit intersections, it had become impossible to tell where the front desk was. She'd have to... She abruptly froze, listening intently. A soft pattering sound. It was hard to tell where it had come from, but it was close. "Mr. Puck? Is that you?" Nothing. She listened, and the pattering sound came again. Just more water dripping somewhere, she thought. Even so, she was more eager than ever to find the door. She chose an aisle at random and moved down it at a brisk walk, heels clicking rapidly against the marble. On both sides of the aisle, the shelves were covered with bones stacked like cordwood, each with a yellowing tag tied to its end. The tags flapped and fluttered in the dread air stirred by her passage. The place was like a crypt. Amid the silence, the darkness, and the ghoulish specimens, it was hard not to think about the set of grisly murders that had occurred just a few years before, within this very sub-basement. It was still the subject of rumor and speculation in the staff lounge. The aisle ended in another jog. "Damn it," thought Nora, looking up and down the long rows of shelving that vanished into the gloom. Another welling of anxiety, harder to fight down this time, and then, once again, she heard, or thought she heard, a noise from behind. This time, it wasn't a pattering, so much as the scrape of a foot on stone. "Who's there?" she demanded, spinning around. "Mr. Puck?" Nothing, save the hiss of steam and the drip of water. She began walking again, a little faster now, telling herself not to be afraid, that the noises were merely the incessant shiftings and settlings of an old, decrepit building. The very corridors seemed watchful. The click of her heels was unbearably loud. She turned a corner and stepped in another puddle of water. She pulled back in disgust. Why didn't they do something about these old pipes? She looked at the puddle again. The water was black, greasy. Not, in fact, water at all. Oil had leaked on the floor, or maybe some chemical preservative. It had a strange, sour smell, but it didn't look like it had leaked from anywhere. She was surrounded by shelves covered with mounted birds, beaks open, eyes wide, wings upraised. What a mess, she thought, turning her expensively bally shoes sideways to find that the oily liquid had soiled the sole and part of the stitching. This place was a disgrace. She pulled an oversized handkerchief from her pocket, a necessary accoutrement to working in a dusty museum, and wiped it along the edge of the shoe. And then, abruptly, she froze. Against the white background of the handkerchief, liquid was not black. It was a deep, glistening red. She dropped the handkerchief and took an involuntary step back, heart hammering. She looked at the pool, stared at it with sudden horror. It was blood. A whole lot of blood. She looked around, wildly. Where had it come from? Had it leaked out of a specimen? But it seemed to just be sitting there, all alone. A large pool of blood in the middle of the aisle. She glanced up, but there was nothing, just the dim ceiling 30 feet above, crisscrossed with pipes. Then she heard what sounded like another footfall, and through a shelf of specimens she glimpsed movement. Then silence returned. But she had definitely heard something. Move. Move. All her instincts cried out. Nora turned and walked quickly down the long aisle. Another sound came. Fast footsteps? The rustle of fabric. And she paused again to listen. Nothing but the faint drips from the pipes. She tried to stare through the isolated gaps in the shelves. There was a wall of specimen jars, snakes coiled in formaldehyde, and she strained to see through. There seemed to be a shape on the other side, large and black, rippled and distorted by the stacks of glass jars. She moved, and it moved in turn. She was sure of it. She backtracked quickly, breath coming faster, and the dark shape moved as well. It seemed to be pacing her in the next aisle, perhaps waiting for her to reach either one end or the other. She slowed and, struggling to master her fear, tried walking as calmly as she could toward the end of the aisle. She could see, hear, the shape. So near now, moving as well, keeping pace. Mr. Puck? She ventured, voice quavering. There was no answer. Suddenly, Nora found herself running. She arrowed down the aisle, sprinting as fast as she could, swift footfalls sounding in the adjoining aisle. Ahead was a gap, where her aisle joined the next. She had to get past, outrun the person in the adjoining aisle. She dashed through the gap, glimpsing for a split second a huge black figure, metal flashing in its gloved hand. She sprinted down the next aisle, through another gap, and on down the aisle again. At the next gap, she veered sharply, right, heading down a new corridor. Selecting another aisle at random, she turned into it and ran on through the dimness ahead. Halfway to the next intersection, she stopped again, heart pounding. There was silence, and for a moment, relief surged through her. She had managed to lose her pursuer. And then she caught the sound of a faint breathing from the adjoining aisle. Relief disappeared as quickly as it had come. She had not outrun him. No matter what she did, no matter where she ran, he had continued to pace her, one aisle over. "Who are you?" she asked. There was a faint rustle, then an almost silent laugh. Nora looked to the left and right, fighting back panic, desperately trying to determine the best way out. These shelves were covered with stacks of folded skins, parchment dry, smelling fearfully of decay. Nothing looked familiar. 20 feet further down the aisle, she spied a gap in the shelving. On the side away from the unknown presence. She sprinted ahead and turned into the gap, then doubled back into yet another adjoining aisle. She stopped, crouched, waited. Footfalls sounded several aisles over, coming closer, then receding again. He had lost her. Nora turned and began moving as stealthily as possible through the aisles, trying to put as much distance as possible between her and the pursuer. But no matter which way she turned, or how fast she ran, whenever she stopped, she could hear the footfalls, rapid and purposeful, seeming to keep pace. She had to figure out where she was. If she kept running around aimlessly, eventually it would catch her. She looked around. The aisle ended in a wall. She was at the edge of the archives. Now, at least, she could follow the wall, make her way to the front. Crouching, she moved along as quickly as she could, listening intently for the sound of footsteps, her eyes scanning the dimness ahead. Suddenly, something yawned out from the gloom. It was a triceratops skull, mounted on the wall, its outlines shadowy and vague in the poor light. Relief flooded through her. Puck must be around here somewhere. The intruder wouldn't dare approach them simultaneously. She opened her mouth to call out softly, but then she paused, looked more closely at the dim outline of the dinosaur. Something was odd. The silhouette was all wrong. She began to move cautiously toward it, and then, abruptly, she stopped again. There, impaled on the horns of the triceratops, hung a body, naked from the waist up, arms and legs hanging loose. 3 bloody horns stuck right through the man's back. It looked as if the Triceratops had gored the person, hoisting him into the air. Nora took a step back. Her mind took in the details, as if from a long distance away. The balding head with a fringe of gray hair, the flabby skin, the withered arms. Where the horns had speared through the lower back, the flesh was one long, open wound. Blood had collected around the base of the horns, running in dark rivulets around the torso and dripping onto the marble. "I'm on the Triceratops in the back. In the back." She heard a scream, realized that it had come from her own throat. Blindly, she wheeled away and ran, veering once, and then again, racing down the aisles as quickly as she could move her legs. And then, abruptly, she found herself in a cul-de-sac. She spun to retrace her steps. And there, blocking the end of the row, stood an antique, black-hatted figure. Something gleamed in his gloved hands. There was nowhere to go but up. Without an instant's thought, she turned, grabbed the edge of a shelf, and began climbing. The figure came flying down the aisle, black cloak billowing behind. Nora was an experienced rock climber. Her years as an archaeologist in Utah, climbing to caves and Anasazi cliff dwellings, were not forgotten. In a minute, she had reached the top shelf, which swayed and groaned under the unexpected weight. She turned frantically, grabbed the first thing that came to hand, a stuffed falcon, and looked down once again. The black-headed man was already below, climbing, face obscured in deep shadow. Nora aimed, then threw. The falcon bounced harmlessly off one shoulder. She looked around desperately for something else. A box of papers, another stuffed animal, more boxes. She threw one, then another, but they were too light, useless. Still, the man climbed. With a sob of terror, she swung over the top shelf and started descending the other side. Abruptly, a gloved hand darted between the shelving, caught hold of her shirt. Nora screamed, ripped herself free. A dim flash of steel and a tiny blade swept past her, missing her eye by inches. She swung away as the blade made another glittering arc toward her. Pain abruptly blossomed in her right shoulder. She cried out, lost her grip. Landing on her feet, she broke her fall by rolling to one side. On the far side of the shelving, the man had quickly climbed back down to the ground. Now he began climbing directly through the shelf, kicking and knocking specimen jars and boxes aside. Again she ran, running wildly, blindly from aisle to aisle. Suddenly, a vast shape rose out of the dimness before her. It was a woolly mammoth. Nora recognized it immediately. She'd been here, once before, with Puck. But which direction was out? As she looked around, Nora realized she would never make it. The pursuer would be upon her in a matter of seconds. Suddenly, she knew there was only one thing to do. Reaching for the light switches at the end of the aisle, she brushed them off with a single movement, plunging the surrounding corridors once again into darkness. Quickly, she felt beneath the mammoth's scratchy belly. There it was. A wooden lever. She tugged, and the trap door fell open. Trying to make as little noise as possible, she climbed into the hot, stuffy belly, pulling the trapdoor up behind her. Then she waited, inside the mammoth. The air stank of rot, dust, jerked meat, mushrooms. She heard a rapid series of clicks. The lights came back on. A stray beam worked through a small hole in the animal's chest. An eye hole for the circus worker. Nora looked out. trying to control her rapid breathing, to push away the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. The man in the derby hat stood not 5 feet away, back turned. Slowly, he rotated himself through 360 degrees, looking, listening intently. He was holding a strange instrument in his hands, 2 polished ivory handles joined by a thin, flexible steel saw with tiny serrations. It looked like some kind of dreadful antique surgical instrument. He flexed it, causing the steel wire to bend and shimmy. His gaze came to rest on the mammoth. He took a step toward it, his face in shadow. It was as if he knew this was where she was hiding. Nora tensed, readying herself to fight to the end. And then, just as suddenly as he had approached, he was gone. "Mr. Puck?" A voice was calling. "Mr. Puck, I'm here! Mr. Puck?" It was Oscar Gibbs. Nora waited, too terrified to move. The voice came closer, and, finally, Oscar Gibbs appeared around the corner of the aisle. "Mr. Puck, where are you?" With a trembling hand, Nora reached down, unlatched the trap door, and lowered herself out of the belly of the mammoth. Gibbs turned, jumped back, and stood there, staring at her open-mouthed. Did you see him?" Nora gasped. "Did you see him?" "Who? What were you doing in there? Hey, you're bleeding!" Nora looked at her shoulder. There was a spreading stain of blood where the scalpel had nicked her. Gibbs came closer. "Look, I don't know what you're doing here, what's going on, but let's get you to the nurse's office, okay?" Nora shook her head. "No. Oscar, you have to call the police right away. Mr. Puck." Her voice broke for a moment. "Mr. Puck's been murdered. And the murderer is right here, in the museum." Decisions. Should I stop here or keep going? I haven't been streaming for 2 hours, but it is also 10:24. Thinking. Unabridged books tend to be so long. I'll keep going for another chapter. Well, another section, because we're in a new section of the book. Mary Norm. Fairly certain that's what that says. Hold up. Chapter 1. Bill Smithback had managed, with a little name-dropping here and a little intimidation there, to get the best seat in the house. The house was the press room of One Police Plaza, a cavernous space painted the institutional color known universally as vomit green. It was now filled to overflowing with scurrying television news crews and frantic journalists. Smithback loved the electric atmosphere of a big press conference, called hastily after some dreadful event, packed with city officials and police brass, laboring under the misapprehension that they could spin the unruly Fourth Estate of New York. He remained in his seat, calm, legs folded, tape recorder loaded, and shotgun mic poised, while pandemonium raged around him. Pandemonium. To his professional nose, it smelled different today. There was an undertone of fear. More than fear, actually. close to ill-suppressed hysteria. He'd seen it as he'd ridden the subway downtown that morning, walked the streets around City Hall. These 3 copycat killings, one on top of another, were just too strange. People were talking of nothing else. The whole city was on the verge of panic. Off to one side, he caught sight of Bryce Harriman, expostulating with a policeman who refused to let him move closer to the front. All that fine vocational training at Columbia Journalism School wasted on the New York Post. He should have taken a nice quiet professorship at his old alma mater. Alma mater. Mater? Mater? I actually can't remember. Teaching callow youth how to write a flawless inverted pyramid. True, the bastard had scooped him on the second murder, on the copycat angle, but surely that was just luck, wasn't it? There was a stir in the crowd. The wing doors of the press room belched out a group of blue suits, followed by the mayor of New York City, Edward Montefiore. The man was tall and solid, very much aware that all eyes were upon him. He paused, nodding to acquaintances here and there, his face reflecting the gravity of the moment. The New York City mayoral race was in full swing, being conducted as usual at the level of 2-year-olds. It was imperative that he catch this killer, bring the copycat murders to an end. The last thing the mayor wanted was to give his rival yet more fodder for his nasty television advertisements, which had been decrying the city's recent upsurge in crime. More people were coming onto the stage. The mayor's spokesperson, Mary Hill, a tall, extremely poised African-American woman. The fat police captain, Sherwood Custer, in whose precinct this whole mess had started. The police commissioner, Rocker, a tall, weary-looking man. And, finally, Dr. Frederick Colopy, director of the museum, followed by Roger Brisbane. Smithback felt a surge of anger when he saw Brisbane, looking urban in a neatly tailored gray suit. Urbane. Brisbane was the one who had screwed up everything between him and Nora. Even after Nora's horrible discovery of Puck's murdered corpse, after being chased and nearly caught herself by the surgeon, she had refused to see him, to let him comfort her. It was almost as if she had blamed him for what had happened to Puck and Pendergast. The noise level in the room was becoming deafening. The mayor mounted the podium and raised his hand. At the gesture, the room quickly fell silent. The mayor read from a prepared statement, his Brooklyn accent filling the room. Oh, I'm gonna butcher this. 2 seconds. Let's see how this goes. Let's think. Not talk like Schlatt. Let's think. Do I even attempt the accent and sound incredibly silly because I've been attempting accents all night, or do I let this one sit? I'm gonna do something real quick, actually. Hold on. Something I never thought of. Two seconds, y'all. I have an idea. Hmm. That might be a little too goofy for me. Okay. Hmm. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, I'm not even going to try it, he began. From time to time, our great city, because of its size and diversity, has been stalked by serial killers. Thankfully, it has been many years since the last such plague. Now, however, it appears we are faced with a new serial killer, a true psychopath. 3 people have been murdered in the space of a week, in a particularly violent way. While the city is now enjoying the lowest murder rate of any major metropolitan area in the country, thanks to our vigorous enforcement efforts and zero tolerance for lawbreaking, that is clearly 3 murders too many. I called this press conference to share with the public the strong and effective steps we are taking to find this killer, and to answer, as best as we can, questions you might have about this case and its somewhat sensational aspects. As you know, openness has always been a top priority of my administration. I, therefore, have brought with me Carl Rocker, the police commissioner, Sherwood Custer, precinct captain, Director Frederick Colopy, and Vice President Roger Brisbane of the New York Museum of Natural History, where the last homicide was discovered. My spokesperson, Mary Hill, will field the questions, but first, I will ask Commissioner Rocker to give you a briefing on the case. He stepped back, and Rocker took the microphone. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. His low, intelligent voice, dry as parchment, filled the room. Last Thursday, the body of a young woman, Doreen Hollander, was discovered in Central Park. She had been murdered, and a peculiar kind of dissection or surgical operation performed on her lower back. While the official autopsy was in progress and the results were being evaluated, a second killing took place. Another young woman, Mandy Eklund, was found in Tompkins Square Park. Forensic analysis indicated that her manner of death and the violence done to her person matched the killing of Doreen Hollander. And yesterday, The body of a 54-year-old man, Reinhard Puck, was discovered in the archives of the New York Museum. He was the museum's head archivist. The body showed mutilation identical to Miss Eklund's and Miss Hollander's. There was a flurry of raised hands, shouts, gestures. The commissioner quelled them by holding up both hands. As you know, a letter was discovered in these same archives, referring to a 19th century serial killer. This letter described similar mutilations, conducted as a scientific experiment by a doctor named Lang in Lower Manhattan, 120 years ago. The remains of 36 individuals were discovered at a building site on Catherine Street, presumably the spot where Dr. Lang did his depraved work. There was another flurry of shouts. Now, the mayor broke in again. An article about the letter appeared in last week's New York Times. It described, in detail, the kind of mutilations Lang had performed on his victims more than a century ago, as well as the reason why he had carried them out. The mayor's eyes roved the crowd and paused momentarily on Smithback. The journalist felt a shiver of pride at the implied recognition. His article. The article appeared to have had an unfortunate effect. It appears to have stimulated a copycat killer, a modern psychopath. What was this? Smithback's smugness vanished before a quickly rising sense of outrage. I am told by police psychiatrists this killer believes, in some twisted way, that by killing these people he will accomplish what Lang tried to accomplish a century ago. That is, extend his lifespan. The sensationalistic approach of the Times article we believe, inflamed the killer and stimulated him to act. This was outrageous. The mayor was blaming him. Smithback looked around and saw that many eyes in the room were on him. He stifled his first impulse to stand up and protest. He had been doing his job as a reporter. It was just a story. How dare the mayor make him the scapegoat? I am not blaming anyone in particular, Montefiore droned on. But I would ask you, ladies and gentlemen of the press, to please show restraint in your coverage. We already have 3 brutal killings on our hands. We are determined not to allow any more. All leads are being followed up vigorously. Let us not inflame the situation further. Thank you. Mary Hill stepped forward to take questions. There was a roar, an instant outcry, as everyone stood up, gesturing madly. Smithback remained seated, flushing deeply. He felt violated. He tried to collect his thoughts, but his shock and outrage made him unable to think. Mary Hill was taking the first question. You said the murderer performed an operation on his victims, somebody asked. Can you elaborate? Basically, the lower portion of the spinal cord had been removed in all 3 victims. Oh, that was not Mary Hill. Basically, the lower portion of the spinal cord had been removed in all 3 victims. The commissioner himself answered. Let me read ahead a second. It's being said that the latest operation was actually performed in the museum, shouted another reporter. Is that so? It is true that a large pool of blood was discovered in the archives, not far from the victim. It appears the blood was, in fact, from the victim, but more forensic tests are underway. Whether the operation was actually performed there must await further lab work. I understand that the FBI have been on the scene, a young woman shouted. Could you tell us the nature of their involvement? That is not entirely correct, Rocker answered. an FBI agent has taken an unofficial interest in the 19th century serial killings, but he has no connection to this case. Is it true that the third body was impaled on the horns of a dinosaur? The commissioner winced slightly. Yes. The body was found affixed to a triceratops skull. Clearly, we are dealing with a seriously deranged individual. About the mutilation of the bodies, is it true that only a surgeon could have done it? It is one lead we are following up. I just want to clarify one point, another reporter said. Are you saying that the Smithback piece in the Times caused these murders? Smithback turned. It was Bryce Harriman, the shit. Commissioner Rocker frowned. What Mayor Montefiore said was... Once again, the mayor intervened. I was merely calling for restraint. To be sure, we wish that article had never appeared. 3 people might be alive today, and the methods the reporter used to acquire this information bear some ethical scrutiny to my mind. But no, I've not said the article caused the killings. Another reporter. Isn't it a bit of a diversion, Your Honor, to blame a reporter who was only doing his job? Smithback craned his neck. Who said that? He was going to buy that man a drink. That is not what I said. I merely said, but you clearly implied that the article triggered the killings. He was going to buy that man drinks and dinner. As Smithback looked around, he could see many of the returning glances were sympathetic. The mayor, in attacking him, had indirectly attacked the entire press corps. Harriman had shot himself in the foot by bringing up the subject. He felt emboldened. Now they would have to call on him. They would have to. May I have the next question, please? Maryhill asked. Do you have any suspects? We've been given a very clear description of the suspect's attire, Commissioner Rocker said. A tall, slender Caucasian male, between 6 foot and 6'2", wearing an old-fashioned black coat and a derby hat, was seen in the archives around the time Mr. Puck's body was found. A similarly dressed man, with a rolled umbrella or cane, was also seen in the vicinity of the second crime scene. I'm not at liberty to give any details beyond that. Smithback stood up, waved. Maryhill ignored him. Miss Perez of New York Magazine. Your question, please. I have a question for Dr. Colopy of the museum, sir. Of the museum. Sir, do you think the killer known as the surgeon is a museum employee? Given that the most recent victims seem to have been killed and dissected in the museum, I mean. Colopy cleared his throat and stepped forward. I believe the police are looking into it, he said in a well-modulated voice. It seems highly unlikely. All our employees now go through criminal background checks, are psychologically profiled, and are thoroughly drug-tested. And it hasn't been proven that the killing actually took place in the museum, I might add. There was another roar as Hill looked from our questions. Smithback shouted and waved his hands along with the rest. Christ, they weren't really going to ignore him. Mr. Diller of Newsday, your question, please. She was avoiding him, the witch. I'd like to address my question to the mayor. Mr. Mayor, how is it that the site on Catherine Street was inadvertently destroyed? Wasn't that site of major historical importance? The mayor stepped forward. No, it was not of historical significance. No historical significance? The largest serial killing in the nation's history. Mr. Diller, this press conference is about the present-day homicides. Please, let's not conflate the two. We had no legal reason to stop construction of a $100 million building. The bones and effects were photographed, studied by the medical examiner, and removed for further analysis. Nothing more could be done. Is it perhaps because Mogan Fairhaven is a major donor to your campaign? Next question, rapped out Hill. Smithback stood up and shouted, Mr. Mayor, since aspersions have been cast, Miss Epstein of WNBC, cried Mary Hill, her powerful voice drowning him out. A slender newswoman stood up, holding a mic, a camera turned on her. Excuse me! Smithback quickly took advantage of the temporary lull. Miss Epstein, since I have been personally attacked, may I respond? The famous anchorwoman didn't pause for a second. Of course, she said graciously, and turned her cameraman to make sure he got it on tape. I'd like to address my question to Mr. Brisbane, Smithback continued, not pausing for a second. Mr. Brisbane, why has the letter that started all this been put off limits, along with all the items from the Shodom collection? The museum isn't trying to hide something, is it? Brisbane rose with an easy smile. Not at all. Those materials have merely been temporarily removed for conservation. It's standard museum procedure. In any case, the letter had already inflamed one copycat murderer into action. To release it now would be irresponsible. The materials are still available to qualified researchers. Is it not true that you tried to prevent employees from working on the case? Not at all. We've cooperated all along. The record speaks for itself. Shit, Smithback thought fast. Mr. Brisbane, Mr. Smithback, care to give someone else a turn? Mary Hill's voice once again sliced through the air. No! Smithback cried to scattered laughter. Mr. Brisbane, isn't it true that Mogan Fairhaven, which gave the museum $2 million last year, not to mention the fact that Fairhaven himself sits on your board, has put pressure on the museum to stop this investigation? Brisbane colored, and Smithback knew his question had hit home. This is an irresponsible allegation. As I said, we've cooperated all along. So you deny threatening your employee, Dr. Nora Kelly, forbidding her to work on the case. Keep in mind, Mr. Brisbane, that we have yet to hear from Nora Kelly herself, the one who found the third victim's body, I might add, and who was chased by the surgeon and almost killed in turn. The clear implication was that Nora Kelly might have something to say that would not agree with Brisbane's account. Brisbane's face darkened as he realized he'd been backed into a corner. I will not answer these hectoring questions. Beside him, Colopy looked grim. Smithback felt a swell of triumph. Mr. Smithback, said Mary Hill, acidly. Are you quite done monopolizing the press conference? Clearly the 19th century homicides have nothing to do with the current serial killings, except as inspiration. And how do you know that? Smithback cried out, his triumph now secure. The mayor now turned to him. Are you suggesting, sir, he said facetiously, that Dr. Lang is still alive and continuing his business? There was a solid round of laughter in the hall. Not at all. Then I suggest you sit down, my friend. Smithback sat down, amid more laughter. His feelings of triumph squashed. He had scored a hit, but they knew how to hit back. As the questions droned on, it slowly dawned on him just what he had done, dragging Nora's name to the press conference. It didn't take him nearly as long to figure out how she would feel about it. Chapter 2. Doyer Street was a short, narrow dogleg of a lane at the southeastern edge of Chinatown. A cluster of tea shops and grocery stores stood at the far end, festooned with bright neon signs in Chinese. Dark clouds scudded across the sky, whipping scraps of paper and leaves off the sidewalk. There was a distant roll of thunder. A storm was coming. O'Shaughnessy paused at the entrance of the deserted lane, and Nora stopped beside him. She shivered, with both fear and cold. She could see him peering up and down the sidewalk, eyes alert for any sign of danger, any possibility that they had been followed. "Number 99 in the middle of the block. It is in the middle of the block," he said in a low voice. "That brownstone there." Nora followed the indicated direction with her eyes. It was a narrow building, like all the others, a 3-story structure of dirty green brick. "Sure you don't want me to go in there with you?" O'Shaughnessy asked. Nora swallowed. "I think it'd be better if you stayed here and watched the street." O'Shaughnessy nodded and slipped into the shadow of a doorway. Taking a deep breath, Nora started forward. The sealed envelope containing Pendergast's banknotes felt like a lead weight within her purse. She shivered again, glancing up and down the dark street, fighting her feelings of agitation. The attack on her and Puck's brutal murder had changed everything. It had proven these were no mere psychotic copycat killings. It had been carefully planned. The murderer had access to the museum's private spaces. He had used Puck's old royal typewriter to type that note, luring her to the archives. He had pursued her with terrifying coolness. She'd felt the man's presence, mere inches away from her, there in the archives. She'd even felt the sting of his scalpel. This was no lunatic. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and why. Whatever the connection between the old killings and the new, this had to be stopped. If there was anything she could do to get the killer, she was willing to do it. There were answers beneath the floor of number 99 Doyer Street. She was going to find those answers. Her mind returned to the terrifying chase, in particular to the flash of the surgeon's scalpel as it flicked toward her, faster than a striking snake. It was an image that she found herself unable to shake. Then the endless police questioning, and afterward her trip to Pendergast's bedside to tell him she had changed her mind about Doyer Street. Pendergast had been alarmed to hear of the attack, reluctant at first, but Nora refused to be swayed. With or without him, she was going down to Doyer's. Ultimately, Pendergast had relented, on the condition that Nora keep O'Shaughnessy by her side at all times, and he had arranged for her to receive the fat packet of cash. She mounted the steps to the front door, steeling herself for the task at hand. She noticed the apartment names beside the buzzer were written in Chinese. She pressed the buzzer for apartment 1. A voice rasped out in Chinese. "I'm the one interested in renting the basement apartment," she called out. The lock snapped free with a buzz. She paused on the door and found herself. She pushed on the door and found herself in a hallway lit by fluorescent lights. I'm stumbling. A narrow staircase ascended to her right. At the end of the hallway, she could hear a door being endlessly unbolted. It opened at last, and a stooped, depressed-looking man appeared, in shirt sleeves and baggy slacks, peering down the hall at her. Nora walked up. "Mr. Ling Li?" He nodded and held the door open for her. Beyond was a living room with a green sofa, a formica table, several easy chairs, and an elaborate red and gold carved bas-relief on the wall, showing a pagoda and trees. A chandelier grossly oversized for the space dominated the room. The wallpaper was lilac, the rug red and black. "Sit down," the man said. His voice was faint and tired. She sat down, sinking alarmingly into the sofa. How you hear about this apartment?" Lee asked. Nora could see from his expression he was not pleased to see her. Nora launched into her story. "A lady who works in the Citibank down the block from here told me about it." "What lady?" Lee asked more sharply. In Chinatown, Pendergast had explained, most landlords preferred to rent to their own. I don't know her name. My uncle told me to talk to her. She said she knew where to find an apartment in this area. She told me to call you. Your uncle? Yes, Uncle Huang. He's with the DHCR. This bit of information was greeted with a dismayed silence. Pendergast figured that having a Chinese relative would make it easier for her to get the apartment, that he worked for the Department of Housing and Community Renewal, the city division that enforced the rent laws, made it all the better. Your name? Betsy Winchell. Nora noticed a large, dark presence move from the kitchen into the doorway of the living room. It was apparently Lee's wife, arms folded, 3 times his size, looking very stern. Over the phone, you said the apartment was available. I'm prepared to take it right away. Please, show it to me. Lee rose from the table and glanced at his wife. Her arms tightened. Follow me, he said. They went back into the hall, out the front door and down the steps. Nora glanced around quickly, but O'Shaughnessy was nowhere to be seen. Lee removed a key, opened the basement apartment door, and snapped on the lights. She followed him in. He closed the door and made a show of relocking no fewer than 4 locks. It was a dismal apartment, long and dark. The only window was a small, barred square beside the front door. The walls were of painted brick, once white but now gray, and the floor was covered with old brick pavers, cracked and chipped. Nora looked at them with a professional interest. They were laid, but not cemented. What was beneath? Dirt? Sand? Concrete? The floor looked just uneven and damp enough to have been laid on dirt. Kitchen and bathroom in back, said Lee, not bothering to point. Nora walked to the rear of the apartment. Here was a cramped kitchen, leading to 2 dark bedrooms and a bath. There were no closets. A window in the rear wall, below grade, allowed feeble brown light from an air shaft to enter between thick steel bars. Nora emerged. Lee was examining the lock on the front door. Have to fix lock, he said in a portentous tone. Many robber tried to get in. You have a lot of break-ins? Lee nodded enthusiastically. Oh, yes, many robber. Very dangerous. Really? Many robber, many mugger. He shook his head sadly. The apartment looks safe, at least. Nora listened. The ceiling seemed fairly soundproof. At least, she could hear nothing from above. Neighborhood not safe for girl. Every day, murder, mugging, robber, rape. Nora knew that, despite its shabby appearance, Chinatown was one of the safest neighborhoods in the city. I'm not worried, she said. Many rule for apartment, said Lee, trying another tack. Is that right? No music, no noise, no man at night. Lee seemed to be searching his mind for other strictures a young woman would find objectionable. No smoke, no drink. Keep clean every day. Nora listened, nodding her agreement. Good. That sounds perfect. I like a neat, quiet place. And I have no boyfriend. With a renewed flash of anger, she thought of Smithback, and how he had dragged her into this mess by publishing that article. To a certain extent, Smithback had been responsible for these copycat killings. Just yesterday, he'd had the nerve to bring up her name at the mayor's news conference, for the whole city to hear. She felt certain that, after what had happened in the archives, her long-term prospects at the museum were never more questionable than before. Were even more questionable than before, not never. I am stumbling. Utility not include. Of course. No air condition. Nora nodded. Lee seemed at a loss. Then his face brightened with a fresh idea. After suicide, no allow gun in apartment. Suicide? Young woman hang herself. Same age as you. A hanging? I thought you mentioned a gun. The man looked confused for a moment. Then his face brightened again. She hang, but it no work. Then shoot herself. I see. She favored the comprehensive approach. Like you, she no have boyfriend. Very sad. How terrible. It happened right in there, said Lee, pointing into the kitchen. Not find body for 3 day. Bad smell. He rolled his eyes and added, in a dramatic undertone, Many worm. How dreadful, Nora said. Then she smiled. But the apartment is just perfect. I'll take it. Lee's look of depression deepened, but he said nothing. She followed him back up to his apartment. Nora sat back down at the sofa, uninvited. The wife was still there, a formidable presence in the kitchen doorway. Her face was screwed into an expression of suspicion and displeasure. Her crossed arms looked like balsa-covered hams. The man sat down unhappily. So, said Nora, let's get this over with. I want to rent the apartment. I need it immediately. Today. Right now. Had to check reference, Lee replied feebly. There's no time, and I'm prepared to pay cash. I need the apartment tonight, or I won't have a place to sleep. As she spoke, she removed Pendergast's envelope. She reached in and took out a brick of $100 bills. The appearance of money brought a loud expostulation from the wife. Lee did not respond. His eyes were on the cash. I have here first month's rent, last month's rent, and a month's deposit. Nora thumped the roll on the tabletop. $6,600. Cash. Bring out the lease. The apartment was dismal, and the rent bordered on outrageous, which was probably why it wasn't gone already. She hoped that hard cash was something Lee could not afford to ignore. There was another sharp comment from the wife. Lee ignored her. He went into the back and returned a few minutes later, laying 2 leases in front of her. They were in Chinese. There was a silence. Need reference, said the wife stolidly, switching to English for Nora's benefit. Need credit check. Nora ignored her. Where do I sign? There, the man pointed. Nora signed Betsy Winchell with a flourish on both leases, and then hand-wrote on each lease a crude receipt. $6,600 received by Mr. Ling Lee. My Uncle Huang will translate it for me. I hope for your sake there's nothing illegal in it. Now you sign. Initial the receipt. There was a sharp noise from the wife. Lee signed his name in Chinese, emboldened, it seemed, by the opposition of his wife. Now give me the keys, and we're done. Have to make copy of keys. You give me those keys. It's my apartment now. I'll make the copies for you at my own expense. I need to start moving in right away. Lee reluctantly handed her the keys. Nora took them, folded one of the leases into her pocket, and stood up. Thank you very much, she said cheerfully, holding out her hand. Lee shook it limply. As the door closed, Nora heard another sharp eruption of displeasure from the wife. This one sounded as if it might go on for a long time. We're nearing the 2-hour mark. What time is it? Hello? Yeah, no. I don't think I can go on for maybe another chapter. Thinking. Weighing options. I started late. That's short enough. Chapter 3. Nora immediately returned to the apartment below. O'Shaughnessy appeared by her side as she unlocked the door. Together, they slipped into the living room, and Nora secured the door with deadbolts and chains. Then she moved to the barred window. 2 nails stuck out from either side of the lintel, on which someone had once hung a makeshift curtain. She removed her coat and hung it across the nails, blocking the view from outside. "Cozy place," O'Shaughnessy said, sniffing. "Smells like a crime scene." Nora didn't answer. She was staring at the floor, already working out the dig in her mind. While O'Shaughnessy cased the apartment, Nora made a circuit of the living room, examining the floor, gritting it off, plotting her lines of attack. Then she knelt and, taking a penknife from her pocket, a knife her brother, Skip, had given her for her 16th birthday, and which she had never traveled without, eased it between the edges of 2 bricks. Slowly, deliberately, she cut away. She cut her way through the crust of grime and old floor wax. She rocked the knife back and forth between the bricks, gently loosening the stonework. Then, bit by bit, she began to work the closest brick from its socket. In a moment, it was free. She pulled it out. Earth. The damp smell rose toward her nostrils. She poked her finger into it. Cool, moist, a little slimy. She probed with the penknife, found it compact but yielding, with little gravel or rocks. Perfect. She straightened up, looked around. O'Shaughnessy was standing behind her, looking down curiously. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Checking the subflooring. And? It's old fill, not cement." "Is that good?" "It's outstanding." "If you say so." She tapped the brick back into place, then stood. She checked her watch. 3 o'clock, Friday afternoon. The museum would close in 2 hours. She turned to O'Shaughnessy. "Look, Patrick, I need you to get up to my office at the museum. Plunder my field locker for some tools and equipment I'll need." I just said field office. Office. I need you to get up to my office at the museum. No, I said office. The woes of a tired brain. O'Shaughnessy shook his head. "Nothing doing. Pendergast said I was to stay with you." "I remember. But I'm here now. Safe. There must be 5 locks on that door. I won't be going anywhere. I'll be a lot safer here than walking the streets. Besides, the killer knows where I work. Would you rather I went uptown and you waited here? Why go anywhere? What's the hurry? Can't we wait until Pendergast is out of the hospital?" She stared at him. "The clock's ticking, Patrick. There's a killer out there." O'Shaughnessy looked at her, hesitated. "We can't afford to just sit around. I hope you're not going to give me a hard time. Pardon? I need those tools, and I need them now." Still, hesitation. Nora felt her anger rise. "Just do it, okay?" O'Shaughnessy sighed. "Double lock the door behind me, and don't open it for anybody. Not the landlord, not the fire department, not Santa Claus. Only me. Promise?" Nora nodded. "I promise." "Good. I'll be back ASAP." She drew up a quick list of items, gave O'Shaughnessy directions, and locked the door carefully behind him, shutting out the sound of the growing storm. Slowly, she stepped away from the door, her eyes swiveling around the room, coming to rest, at last, on the brickwork beneath her feet. 100 years before, Lang, for all his genius, could not have anticipated the reach of modern archaeology. She would excavate the site with the greatest care, sifting through his laboratory layer by layer, bringing all her skills to bear in order to capture even the smallest piece of evidence. and there would be evidence. She knew that. There was no such thing as a barren archaeological site. People, wherever they went, whatever they did, always left a record. Taking out her penknife, she knelt again. Once again, began easing the blade between the old bricks. No, she knelt and, once again, began easing the blade between the old bricks. There was a sudden peal of thunder, louder than any that had come before. She paused, heart beating wildly with terror. She forced her feelings back under control, shaking her head ruefully. No killer was going to stop her from finding out what was beneath this floor. She wondered briefly what Brisbane would say to this work. The hell with him, she thought. She turned the penknife over in her hands, closed it with a sigh. All her professional life, she had unearthed and catalogued human bones without emotion, with no connection to the ancient skeletons beyond a shared humanity. But Mary Green had proven utterly different. There, outside the girl's house, Pendergast had thrown Mary Green's short life and awful death into sharp relief. For the first time, Nora realized she had excavated, handled the bones of someone that she could understand, grieve for. More and more, Pendergast's tale of Mary Green was sinking in, despite her attempts to keep a professional distance. And now, she had almost become another Mary Green. That made it personal. Very personal. Her thoughts were interrupted by the rattle of wind at the door, and another, fainter rumble of thunder. Nora rose to her knees, opened the penknife again, and began scraping vigorously at the brickwork beneath her feet. It was going to be a long night. That's a good place to stop. I will apologize for the unsureness of my person. But I hope y'all enjoyed, even if I did start a bit late. And it is late, I'd rather not go into midnight. Even with all the flubs, it is still fun reading. And that maybe will persist into next Monday. Not uncertainty at streaming, just uncertainty of if I will read or do something else. You will still get something. Just not sure what. But, in any case, 'twas fun reading to y'all. For those who are still here listening. And I will bid you a very good night and sweet dreams. From my desk to yours, I hope you have a pleasant evening.